Welcome to Crimson Ledger. I am your host, Oliver. Let's begin the mystery. The morning had unfolded with the kind of golden light reserved for storybooks, where bees hummed lazily over foxgloves, and the scent of freshly mown grass mingled with lavender wafting from tidy garden hedges. In the village of St Elwick's, a place where news travelled faster than the parish bell, such light felt like a sign. A blessing, perhaps, for what was to be the social event of the season. The wedding of Penelope Lytton Stone, the brigadier's only daughter, to young Arthur Pomfret, son of the county's solicitor and a favourite at the local cricket club. Miss Marple had awoken just after 6, as was her habit, and noted the weather with quiet satisfaction. "A good omen," she murmured to herself, standing by the lace-trimmed window of her cottage. The sky was a pale blue canvas, unmarred by clouds, and in the distance she could already see the gardeners bustling about the vicarage, setting up rows of white chairs and arranging the last of the floral arches. It would be, everyone agreed, a beautiful day. By mid-morning, the village had transformed. The narrow lanes of St Elwick's were lined with bunting in pastel shades, fluttering softly in the breeze. Trestled tables had been erected in front gardens, weighed down with scones, trifles, and lemon tarts in anticipation of the walk-bys. Children, scrubbed to shining and dressed in itchy Sunday clothes, clutched confetti cones. Even old Mrs. Dancy, who hadn't left her house since the Jubilee, could be seen peering from behind her window netting. The wedding was to take place at noon in the old stone church of St. Catherine's, and nearly every resident of the village had received an invitation to the reception in the vicar's garden afterward. The guest list included not just the local gentry and business owners, but an eclectic mix of personalities, some long admired, others quietly resented. Penelope, tall and graceful, was well liked, though not without whispers. The suddenness of the engagement had raised eyebrows, as had Arthur's unexpected departure from London only months before. Still, whatever scandal may have hovered in private thought, none dared spoil the pageantry of the day. The reception was to feature an orchestra, a champagne fountain, and a magician from Cheltenham. Everything, down to the embroidered linen napkins, had been planned to perfection. Miss Marple arrived precisely at 11:55, taking her place in a modest seat near the rear garden. She wore a pale grey ensemble, soft wool, with a sensible brooch and a hat that spoke of restraint rather than vanity. She always said one could learn more from the back row than the front pew. As the bride and groom arrived, flanked by bridesmaids in coral chiffon and groomsmen in mourning coats, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile. The scene was lovely. So lovely, in fact, that it nearly masked the quiet tensions humming just beneath the surface. She noted them as naturally as others noted the weather. Colonel Masters, the brigadier's old comrade, shifted uncomfortably when seated next to Letitia Price. Once his fiancée, long before the war and far before his wife had passed away. Reverend Bloxham's hands trembled slightly as he shook the groom's hand. His face, already flushed from the sun, grew redder when the bride kissed his cheek. Agnes Taylor, the florist's daughter and former schoolmate of Penelope's, clapped too loudly at the vows, while her eyes lingered too long on the best man. And then there was the best man himself, Julian Hargrove. He had the air of someone perpetually laughing at a joke only he understood. Tall, bronzed from a recent Mediterranean holiday, and with a laugh that never quite reached his eyes, Julian was the sort of man who inspired both admiration and unease. He'd once worked in international banking, or perhaps real estate. It was never quite clear. Rumors, as they often did in villages like St Elwick's, abounded. Affairs with married women, whispered debts, a scandal involving the foreign secretary's daughter. Still, he was charming, exceedingly so. And Penelope, radiant in silk and pearls, had insisted he stand beside Arthur. The ceremony passed without mishap. Vows were exchanged, tears dabbed and hymns sung with varying degrees of accuracy. When the reception began, the orchestra played a delicate waltz as guests drifted to their assigned tables. Champagne flowed. Children ran between rose bushes. Laughter bloomed, though some smiles were stretched too wide. Miss Marple declined the champagne. Instead, she sipped lightly steeped tea and watched, always watching. Her eyes flitted over faces, over movements that others might dismiss. A handshake too firm, a glance that lingered a moment too long, a silence where words might have been expected. She did not pry. She merely noticed. At precisely 12:43 p.m., just as the photographer called for the wedding party to assemble beneath the rose-draped arch, a scream tore through the gentle summer air. It was sharp, panicked, female. All heads turned. A flurry of motion erupted near the far end of the marquee, by the long table where desserts had only just been laid out. Guests jostled, chairs clattered. Somewhere, a child began to cry. In the midst of the confusion, Arthur Pomfret dropped his champagne flute. Penelope's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. There, beside the gleaming silver cake knife and the untouched lemon tart, Julian Hargrove lay slumped against the side of the champagne fountain. His cravat was dark with blood. One arm dangled limply, fingers grazing the grass. His expression was blank, his eyes open and fixed on nothing. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Dancy fainted outright. Colonel Masters barked something unintelligible. Letitia Price screamed again, and yet, amid the chaos, Miss Marple remained seated. She did not leap from her chair or push through the crowd. Instead, she tilted her head ever so slightly, her knitting untouched in her lap. She observed the reactions, the ones immediate and theatrical, and the ones slow, calculating. Because Jane Marple had seen this before. Not the exact scene, of course, but the pattern, and patterns, she knew, rarely lied. Moments later, the village doctor was summoned. The police would follow. Speculation would blossom like ivy, fast, clinging, and hard to contain. But Miss Marple, seated quietly beneath the lilac tree, had already begun the real work. Not from guessing, but from listening. Not to the screams or the sobs, but to the gentle rustling beneath them. The sound of secrets unraveling. The shock did not linger in silence for long. Within the hour, the news had spread across St. Elwick's faster than the lace bunting could flutter in the afternoon breeze. A death? No, a murder, as some were already daring to say, had occurred at the wedding of Penelope Lytton Stone. The day meant for bouquets and confetti had turned to whispered theories and shaken nerves. Miss Marple, having quietly excused herself from the garden soon after the arrival of the constable, had walked home with her usual deliberate pace, nodding gently at those she passed. Her expression bore nothing unusual. If one didn't know her well, one might assume she was still thinking about the rose-patterned tablecloths or the bride's rather modern choice of footwear. But those familiar with Jane Marple would have recognized the subtle narrowing of her eyes, the faint downward turn of her lips. Beneath the calm surface, her mind was already sorting through faces, fragments of conversation, and gestures too easily dismissed by others. Back at her cottage, she sat by the hearth and poured herself a cup of tea, not too strong, with a hint of milk, and took out her knitting. She worked slowly, looping the yarn with delicate precision, though her mind was elsewhere. By evening, the entire village was abuzz. At the grocer's, Mrs. Headley had taken it upon herself to inform every customer in great detail about the precise moment she had seen the champagne fountain tilt ever so slightly, followed by the scream. She insisted she had been only 3 steps away from the scene, though in truth she had been seated near the string quartet. "I knew that man was trouble," she declared, thumping a cabbage on the counter for emphasis. "You could tell. That hair, all those holidays, never trusted a man who tans more than he reads." At the post office, Mr. Finch, the retired schoolmaster, leaned on his cane and shook his head gravely. Poison, perhaps, he mused, though he admitted he hadn't seen anything suspicious. But if you ask me, it's always someone from the inside. It's never the outsider. No one ever stabs you from the front these days. Over at the Hare and Hound pub, the conversation had already taken a darker turn. A group of men sat clustered around the far table, nursing pints and tossing theories like darts. "It's the bride, mark my words," muttered Ted Withers, the local handyman, lowering his voice and glancing about as if Penelope herself might burst through the doors. "I heard she had a fling with the best man before Arthur. Maybe he tried to blackmail her." "That's nonsense," countered Joe Lamb, the butcher, who was already 3 ales in. "It's always money. Probably the groom, jealous, you know. Knew he couldn't compete, or maybe the best man knew something serious." "Or the brigadier," someone whispered. "Military types have ways of making things disappear." And so the village, ever so proper and picturesque, unraveled into a dozen tangled strands of suspicion. Miss Marple, however, did not engage in the speculation. Not openly. She listened, of course. She always listened, but she knew better than to seize on the first flash of gossip or the most theatrical theory. Truth, in her experience, rarely wore bright colors. It crept quietly, dressed in gray, hiding beneath the familiar. The next morning brought a cold drizzle, as if the sky itself had sobered overnight. The bunting, soaked and drooping, looked less festive and more like a forgotten decoration from a ghost town. A police motor car stood parked outside the brigadier's house. Uniformed officers moved with careful steps, mindful not to trample evidence, though what evidence there could be, Miss Marple doubted they would notice. Detective Inspector Caldwell, brought in from the county, was a tall man with a thick mustache and a penchant for briskness. He had already made inquiries at the vicarage and questioned a handful of guests, including Arthur Pomfret, who now sat pale and shaken in his father's study. Penelope, it was said, had not spoken a word since the incident. Miss Marple received a polite visit as well. The constable, young and polite, had asked if she'd seen anything unusual during the reception. She smiled kindly and offered him a scone. "I saw a great deal, dear," she said, stirring her tea, "but very little that was out of place at the time." He blinked, unsure whether to press further. She patted his hand and assured him she would reach out should anything come to mind. "Of course, I find it's not the thing itself that's often the clue," she added, "but the change in things. How people respond, how people return to routine, or fail to. It was the sort of vague observation he would likely file away and forget. But Miss Marple had already begun cataloguing responses. She noted, for instance, how quickly the florist's daughter, Agnes Taylor, had moved to help Penelope after the scream. How her eyes had flicked toward the cake table, then away again, far too quickly. She'd also remembered that Julian Hargrove had spent an unusually long time talking to the vicar just before the ceremony, an animated discussion by the old yew tree, their faces obscured by distance but not by posture. And there was the matter of the envelope the caterer's boy had dropped behind the marquee, found by young George Merriweather, who'd run off with it before anyone could say a word. It was all small, insignificant perhaps, but Miss Marple knew that evil, when it visited a place like St. Elwick's, rarely made a grand entrance. It arrived in the quiet spaces, in omissions, in glances, in gestures. That afternoon, she took a walk through the village, not aimlessly, as some might think, but with quiet purpose. She stopped at the greengrocer's and asked about tomatoes, then listened as Mrs. Headley repeated her account, now embellished with the claim that she'd seen a shadow behind the champagne tent. At the churchyard, she paused to admire the flower beds, conveniently crossing paths with Reverend Bloxham, who looked more frazzled than usual. When she inquired gently after his health, he assured her he was fine, just tired. But his hands trembled slightly as he held his prayer book, and his voice faltered when asked about Julian Hargrove. He was a generous man, the Reverend said. Enthusiastic, he'd offered to donate to the Bell Restoration Fund. Spoke to me only an hour before the wedding. What about? She asked. He hesitated. Nothing of consequence. He seemed to want to unburden himself, but I assumed it was wedding nerves. Miss Marple nodded slowly. In the evening, she sat by the window, watching the drizzle turn to mist. In her lap, the knitting had stopped moving. She was thinking of weddings and masks, of secrets dressed in lace, and of the look on Penelope's face, not fear exactly, but something colder. She did not yet know who had killed Julian Hargrove. But she knew this much. The village was lying, not all at once, not everyone, but collectively, like a house whispering through its floorboards. And the truth, she thought, was waiting somewhere between the cracks. She would find it, not with force, not with bloodhounds or laboratories or magnifying glasses, but with quiet persistence, with observation, with the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had seen too much and been overlooked too often. Tomorrow she will bake a sponge cake and pay a few visits, not to interrogate, simply to chat. She had found that people often revealed the most when they thought nothing of what they were saying at all, and Miss Marple always listened. By the third day, the shock had dulled into something more manageable, though not quite forgettable. In a place like St. Elwick's, life always found its rhythm again, however offbeat it might feel for a while. The grocer's shelves were stocked. The post arrived on time. The vicar resumed his weekly sermon planning, albeit with more frowns than usual. Yet the quiet hum of the village had changed its tone, like a familiar melody played in a different key. Julian Hargrove's body had been removed by the authorities under quiet protocol, avoiding further spectacle. The local newspaper printed a carefully worded article about the tragedy at the Littenstone wedding, using phrases like unconfirmed cause and pending investigation. There was no mention of poison, no reference to bruising, and certainly no allusion to scandal. Not yet. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had spent the morning baking, a light lemon sponge with a thin glaze, and by afternoon she had made her way up the garden path toward the home of Brigadier Littenstone. She was not expected, which was precisely the point. A woman of her generation and manner could arrive unannounced under the comforting guise of neighborly concern. She rang the bell once and waited, hands folded gently around the tin containing the cake. It was Letitia Price, the housekeeper, who answered. Her eyes were red-rimmed, though Miss Marple suspected that had less to do with grief and more with the stress of managing a household teetering on the edge of scandal. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice hushed but surprised. "How kind of you." "I thought the Brigadier and dear Penelope might appreciate a little something sweet," Miss Marple replied gently. "It helps, I've found, when the world feels a touch bitter." Letitia ushered her inside and led her to the drawing room. The curtains were drawn, and though the fireplace had not been lit, the air felt heavy with unsaid things. The Brigadier sat in his chair, one hand resting on a polished cane, his face like carved granite. Penelope, in contrast, stood at the window still in her bridal dressing gown, though the veil and flowers were gone. Her expression was unreadable. "My dear Miss Marple," the Brigadier said with stiff courtesy, "you are too good." "I won't stay long," she assured him, setting the tin on the tea tray. "But I did want to say how sorry I am. Such a dreadful thing, especially on such a joyful day." Penelope turned then, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Miss Marple noticed it at once. The strain behind her pale complexion, the faint tremble in her fingers, the way her lips pressed tightly together before she managed a polite smile. "Thank you," Penelope said softly. "Everyone's been very considerate." "I do hope the police have been gentle," Miss Marple continued, picking up her knitting from her bag. "They can be terribly brisk sometimes when it's really sympathy that's needed most." The Brigadier shifted uncomfortably. Detective Inspector Caldwell has been thorough, as one would expect. Thorough and, regrettably, not the most delicate man. He suspects someone close, Penelope said suddenly. Her voice was quiet, but the words hung like smoke in the room. He hasn't said it outright, but I know. He thinks it was. Someone here. One of us. And what do you think, my dear? Miss Marple asked, her voice calm. Penelope hesitated, then turned back to the window. I think Julian had secrets, and secrets make enemies. The brigadier cleared his throat as if to end the conversation, but Miss Marple had already heard what she needed. Not just the words, but the way they'd been spoken. Later that day, Miss Marple stopped by the church. Reverend Bloxham greeted her with a distracted nod, gesturing for her to sit beside the dais while he fiddled with flower arrangements left over from the wedding. He looked pale, not sickly, but strained. I imagine you've had quite the week, Miss Marple said as she sat. He let out a quiet laugh, more air than amusement. That would be an understatement. You knew Mr. Hargrove well? The Reverend set down a vase, carefully arranging the drooping lilies. Not well. He only came down to the village a month before the wedding. I had a few conversations with him, enthusiastic about the church restoration project, oddly enough. Oddly? Well, it wasn't just interest. He was insistent. Said he wanted to donate. Even asked if we kept ledgers and who had access to them. At first I thought it was just curiosity, but it did seem like an unusual line of questioning. Miss Marple's needles stopped mid-stitch. Did you mention that to the police? I did, but I don't think they took it seriously. They're focused on interpersonal motives, jealousy, love affairs, that sort of thing. She nodded gently. And you? What do you think? He paused for a long time. I think Julian Hargrove was a man who knew too much about too many people. That night, back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the lamp and jotted a few notes into her diary. Names, details, impressions, not conclusions. She was far too experienced for that. But threads, pieces of the tapestry. She thought of Agnes Taylor next, the florist's daughter. At the wedding, she had been too quick to cry, and not in the sentimental way. Something had lingered in her expression, an anxiety, tightly masked. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the flower shop under the pretext of buying a small arrangement for her kitchen window. Agnes was alone, trimming stems with a knife that gleamed beneath the flickering shop light. You did such a beautiful job with the wedding flowers, Miss Marple said, her tone warm. Agnes offered a nervous smile. Thank you. It was such a shame what happened. Yes, terrible. She studied the girl for a moment. Did you know Mr. Hargrove before the wedding? Agnes hesitated, just for a breath. Not really. I mean, I saw him around. He came in once or twice, asking about orchids. Orchids, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Yes, he said Penelope liked them, but I don't think she does. He seemed distracted that day, kept, asking if certain flowers had meanings. Miss Marple smiled. And do they? Agnes relaxed a little, eager to speak on a topic she knew well. Oh, yes. Orchids mean vanity or seduction, depending on the color, but lilies, that's what he ended up buying. Calla lilies. The old woman nodded slowly. Lilies at a wedding. That is unusual. Later that afternoon, she passed the green where children played, oblivious to the stirrings in the adult world. She saw young George Merriweather sitting on the bench, swinging his legs. He was eating a toffee apple, eyes bright. You were quite brave at the wedding, Miss Marple said, sitting beside him. I didn't do anything, he replied proudly. I heard you found an envelope, she said. George looked up sharply. Didn't open it. Of course not. But do you still have it? He reached into his coat and pulled it out. A plain cream envelope, now slightly creased. Miss Marple took it carefully. It was unmarked. No address. Sealed. She did not open it immediately. She would do so in private, but in her mind, a piece had just shifted into place. The investigation was no longer a question of if Julian Hargrove had secrets. It was a matter of who those secrets belonged to and how far they'd go to keep them buried. By the time the envelope was carefully opened on Miss Marple's writing desk, the whispers in St. Elwick's had taken on the sharpness of accusation. What had begun as murmurs had become pointed suggestions, half-truths twisted into near certainties. The village, so often charming and genteel, had grown suspicious of its own reflection. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of thick cream paper. The handwriting was smooth, deliberate, and without a signature. The message, though brief, carried a weight that settled heavily in Miss Marple's chest. They think I don't know, but I do. If anything happens to me, start with the bride's father, then the vicar. The rest will follow. She read the note twice, then a third time. It was not a confession, nor was it a direct accusation, but it was unmistakably a warning. And whoever wrote it had sensed danger long before the wedding toast was poured. Miss Marple folded the paper neatly and tucked it back into the envelope. It was not the kind of thing to hand over to the police just yet. Not until she understood more. If the note was genuine, and her instincts told her it was, then Julian Hargrove had known precisely where to look, and what he found must have rattled more than one cage. By mid-morning, Inspector Caldwell had shifted from polite questioning to more aggressive tactics. His frustration, thinly veiled in earlier interviews, had begun to show. A man had died in broad daylight, in full view of nearly 100 people, and yet no one had seen anything useful, or so they claimed. The inspector began to focus on what he believed to be the most plausible explanation: jealousy. A romantic entanglement, a love triangle gone sour, a scorned suitor. The usual narrative. It was easy to explain and even easier to believe. Arthur Pomfret was the first to face the weight of suspicion. He had grown quiet since the wedding. Pale, thin, and jittery, he seemed a shadow of the young man who had once been the pride of the cricket pitch. When summoned for questioning at the constable's office, he arrived late, stammering apologies, his tie askew and his collar damp with sweat. "I didn't kill him," he said, voice trembling. "Why would I? Julian was my best friend." Inspector Caldwell sat across the table, arms folded. "Some say he was more than that to your bride." Arthur's eyes widened. "That's not true." "No?" Caldwell leaned in. "You didn't find their closeness odd? The late-night meetings? The laughter? The secrets?" Arthur shook his head. "Julian was charismatic. He flirted with everyone. Penelope didn't mean anything by it." "Perhaps not," the inspector replied coldly. "But perhaps he did." When Arthur left the station, his hands were shaking. He avoided the eyes of villagers on his way home. Miss Marple, watching discreetly from her garden path, noted the look not of guilt, but of confusion, of someone trying to convince himself of something that didn't sit quite right in his heart. The second suspect came from an entirely different corner of the mystery. Letitia Price, the brigadier's housekeeper, had served the family for nearly 3 decades. She was trusted, loyal, and fiercely protective of Penelope. But as Miss Marple knew well, such protectiveness often hid deeper currents. Letitia had been the first to run toward the body that day. She had knelt beside Julian Hargrove before anyone else had dared move. She had called out for help, touched the body, even attempted to loosen his cravat. It had all seemed like panic and concern, but Miss Marple wondered now if there had been something more. Letitia was summoned next. At the station, she sat upright, composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I did what anyone would do," she told Inspector Caldwell calmly. The poor man had collapsed. "I tried to help. You touched the body. Of course, he might have been choking. You knew him well?" Letitia hesitated. I knew of him. He was often in the house, helping Penelope with wedding arrangements. Helping? The inspector repeated. Is that what you'd call it? Letitia's lips thinned. I know what you're implying. But Penelope is a good girl. Julian was overfamiliar, but she would never have reciprocated. Caldwell pressed further, but Letitia's demeanor never cracked. Yet Miss Marple, listening later to the account through her conversation with the constable's wife, sensed it again. Something guarded. A wall too carefully built. And then there was the vicar. Reverend Bloxham, once merely anxious, had become visibly haunted. He still held his services, still read from the pulpit, but there was a weight on his shoulders that no sermon could lift. The inspector paid him a visit behind closed doors. The next day, it was the talk of the green. No one knew what was said, only that the vicar had not left the rectory since. Miss Marple took it upon herself to visit him once more. She brought a jar of blackberry jam, his favorite, she remembered, and knocked gently on the study door. He looked worse than before. His collar was undone, his hair slightly disheveled. Miss Marple, he said with a tired smile, I'm afraid I've not much appetite for jam today. You must try to eat, she replied, setting the jar down anyway. A man can't think clearly on an empty stomach. He sat heavily in the armchair across from her. I suppose you've heard I'm a suspect now. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at the fire, watching the embers shift and spark. Only by those who don't know you well, she said at last. But that doesn't mean there isn't something troubling you. He didn't speak for a moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. Julian, he told me something, the day before the wedding. Something he'd uncovered. He said it wasn't about love or jealousy, but about trust, about betrayal. He wanted to reveal it during the speeches. Said it would change everything. Miss Marple looked up sharply. Did he say what it was? The vicar shook his head. Only that it involved money, and someone highly respected. That evening, as rain drizzled against the windows of her cottage, Miss Marple sat quietly in her armchair. The list of suspects had grown, but not in the way Inspector Caldwell imagined. He saw lovers and rivals. She saw protectors, secrets, and shifting loyalties. Arthur Pomfret, frightened and confused. Letitia Price, fiercely loyal, perhaps to a fault. Reverend Bloxham, burdened with truths he hadn't asked for, and behind it all, the quiet thread of something else. Something hidden beneath the elegant surface of the wedding. A financial betrayal, a secret deal, perhaps a crime far older than the murder itself. Julian Hargrove had threatened to reveal it, and now he was dead. Miss Marple reached for her notebook. The list of names had grown longer, but soon, she knew, one would begin to rise above the others, not through drama, but through detail, because the truth always left a trail, even if it was written in disappearing ink. The rain returned with a steady rhythm, drumming softly on rooftops and turning the cobbled paths of St Elwick's into winding streams of glistening stone. The village, still tense under the weight of suspicion, moved about its business with forced cheerfulness. At the tea shop, the clink of china cups masked uneasy silences. In the churchyard, even the birds seemed quieter, as though nature itself were listening. Miss Marple, as was her custom, remained a quiet presence in the background. She attended the weekly church service, nodded to the vicar with polite grace, and declined any conversation about the murder, except to say how dreadful it all was. But inside her mind, the threads were weaving tighter. There was something she had missed, a small detail, something not shouted, but whispered. It came to her, not through confrontation or deduction, but through dust. She had returned to the scene of the reception under the pretense of visiting the vicar. Reverend Bloxham, pale and drawn, had offered her tea and drifted in and out of the conversation, with the fog of a man carrying more than one burden. After some careful nudging and a reassurance that she simply wished to admire the rose garden again, the vicar permitted her to walk alone through the grounds. The marquee had been taken down, the chairs had been returned to the parish hall, but the grounds still remembered. The flattened grass, the faint imprint of footsteps where the dessert table had stood, and something else, near the edge of the fountain's stone base, half covered by a fallen petal from a wilting hydrangea. Miss Marple bent carefully, brushing the petal aside. A cufflink. It was gold-plated, shaped like a small chess knight. Elegant, refined, and very much out of place. She turned it over in her gloved hand, examining the back. There was no engraving, but the clasp was slightly bent, as if pulled loose. She looked around. The fountain had been drained, and the grass was patchy from where too many shoes had trampled through. But no one had claimed the cufflink. That in itself was telling. She placed it in her handbag and left the garden without comment. Back at home, she laid the cufflink on a sheet of white paper and stared at it for several minutes. It wasn't evidence in the traditional sense. No blood, no fingerprints, no note attached. But it was a voice. A whisper from the scene itself. And she knew one thing without doubt. Julian Hargrove had not worn cufflinks at the wedding. He had arrived in a tailored but slightly flamboyant suit, pale blue with pearl buttons, no French cuffs. She remembered the detail because it had struck her at the time as unusual. A best man choosing fashion over formality. It had seemed harmless. So if the cufflink did not belong to the victim, whose was it? The answer came to her the next day. She saw him while passing the brigadier's home. A tall man in a charcoal grey coat and dark gloves, striding from the house toward his parked car. His movements were quick, precise, as though he had little time for small talk or second thoughts. Colonel Richard Masters, the brigadier's oldest friend and former war comrade. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. She had noticed him too at the wedding. Not front and center, but always within reach of the family. His manner had been pleasant, but distant, reserved. There had been something about the way he had looked at Julian Hargrove, polite but stiff, as if tolerating him more than enjoying his company. She waited until the colonel had driven away, then continued down the lane to the post office. Mrs. Headley was inside, of course, chatting with the postmaster about nothing in particular. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said as soon as the door opened. "You must have heard. The inspectors had the groom back in for more questioning. Poor lad's looking thinner by the hour." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple replied. "And quite unnecessary, I should think." Mrs. Headley leaned in, lowering her voice. "They say he had an argument with Mr. Hargrove the day before the wedding. Something about a business deal." "Business?" Miss Marple's brow lifted. "That seems unlikely. Arthur's father handles all the firm's affairs, doesn't he?" "So they say. But money makes fools of clever men, Jane, and Julian Hargrove was no angel. You know what I heard? He had leverage on someone. Proper leverage. The blackmailing kind." Miss Marple didn't confirm or deny. She simply smiled, thanked her for the stamps, and made her way back into the rain. That evening, she wrote a letter. Not to the police, not to the family, but to herself. A list, unclaimed cufflink, found near the body. Not Julian's. Colonel Masters. Frequently near the fountain. Wears French cuffs. Chess knight motif spotted on lapel pin. Past military dealings with brigadier. Close friendship, but tensions observed at the wedding. Conversation overheard. You should have kept your mouth shut. Spoken by Colonel, overheard by George Merriweather. She tapped her pen gently against her chin. There was something else. Agnes. The florist had mentioned lilies. Calla lilies, unusual for a wedding. Symbolic of death or mourning, depending on the color. And Julian had requested them himself. Why? To provoke? To signal something? Or to remind someone? The flowers had been placed directly behind the dessert table where he had fallen. a visual statement, perhaps even a message. Miss Marple felt a chill creep into her spine. Julian Hargrove had not been careless. He had been deliberate. Each act, each word had been chosen. She glanced toward the window where the wind had begun to pick up. Somewhere out there, someone was panicking. The note Julian left, the confrontation with the vicar, the mysterious cufflink. They were fragments, but they were converging. And yet, there was still no body to the motive. Just hints, just shadows. She needed more. The next day, she paid a visit to Mr. Ellery, the solicitor, a sprightly man with thinning hair and spectacles that never quite sat straight on his nose. He was kind enough to entertain her questions over tea. "Miss Marple?" he said after she inquired about Julian's presence in
history dates of cases we hadn't yet solved. One date, circled in red ink, August 23rd, 1893, 2 days from now. Subject retirement recommended. Conclusion, Exhibit 48 complete. Return to archive. Holmes closed the book. "I understand now," he said. I steadied myself. "Understand what?" "Why they chose me." He turned to me, and though his voice remained calm, I could see the storm behind his eyes. "Because they could not rewrite me. And so they tried something worse. They rewrote everything around me. The crimes, the criminals, even you." He placed a hand on my shoulder. "You, Watson, were never the target. You were the tether, the stable character. They used you to calibrate my story." I could not speak. He let the silence settle, then added, "But a story only holds power when it is believed." Holmes carried the book back to Baker Street that night. He did not burn it. He did not hide it. He placed it on the mantel above the fireplace, a warning, or perhaps a message. I asked him what we should do now. His response chilled me. "Nothing, for now. We vanish." Chapter 10. In the days following our discovery of the versioning of Sherlock Holmes, Holmes withdrew into a state I can only describe as surgical silence. He neither played his violin nor pursued his chemistry experiments. He refused even the London dailies, which he once devoured with a kind of carnivorous detachment. Instead, he read the ledger, again and again and again, not as a reader, but as a surgeon seeking the infection beneath the skin of narrative. "The archivist wrote more than records," he muttered to me once. "He wrote intention." On the third day, I noticed something he hadn't mentioned, perhaps because he assumed I'd seen it already. On page 48 of the manuscript, his so-called exhibit page, there was a phrase scrawled in the margin, in a different ink. He wasn't there, but he remembered it. I pointed to it. "Holmes, what does this mean?" He studied the sentence without blinking. And then, in a voice that barely rose above a breath, "It means there was a witness, but not a person." That evening, Holmes led me once more into the city. This time not to a theatre or church or archive, but to Garrick's Books, a narrow little shop hidden between a tobacconist and a clock repairer on Maiden Lane. "Garrick," Holmes said as we entered, "isn't a bookseller, not truly. He is a mnemonicist, a man who collects memory artifacts disguised as literature." The shop smelled of dust, dry leather, and faint cologne. A tall man with owlish spectacles emerged from behind a curtain and blinked at us. "Mr. Holmes," he said with the forced cheer of a man who has never enjoyed being correct. "I rather hoped you wouldn't come." "I rather hoped I wouldn't need to," Holmes replied. Garrick exhaled and gestured for us to follow. He led us to a private room at the back, walls lined not with
photographs. Smiles were easy to fake in a still image. When Letitia returned with the tray, her hands were shaking slightly. Not enough to spill, but enough for Miss Marple to notice. She watched as Letitia placed the cups, her gaze avoiding Penelope's altogether. Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly. "You must miss Mr. Hargrove terribly." Penelope's hand froze midway through stirring her sugar. She set the spoon down with care. "Yes," she said after a long pause. "He was a dear friend." Letitia glanced up sharply at that, then turned away. Miss Marple let the silence hang before speaking again. "I wonder, Penelope, did he ever speak to you about the estate? About legal matters?" Penelope looked startled. "Legal matters? I ask only because he'd recently been inquiring about inheritance laws. Quite curious, really." The young bride looked down, her fingers tightening around the handle of her teacup. "He did ask strange questions once, about the house, about what would happen if something were to happen to Father. I thought it was just idle talk." Miss Marple nodded slowly, pretending to examine the embroidery on her napkin. "And your father, did he approve of Mr. Hargrove?" Penelope's lips thinned. He tolerated him. Julian had a way of making people uneasy, even when he was smiling. Letitia, who had been quietly refilling the sugar bowl, spoke then, quietly, but with steel behind her voice. "He wasn't who he pretended to be." The room fell still. Miss Marple turned toward her. "What do you mean?" Letitia hesitated, then met her eyes. "Julian came here pretending to be Penelope's friend, but he was digging, always asking questions, about money, about the colonel, about the brigadier's time overseas. It was unnatural." Penelope looked alarmed. "Letitia—" "No, Miss Penelope, forgive me, but someone has to say it." Letitia turned back to Miss Marple. "He was blackmailing someone. I don't know who, but he had leverage. I found letters, hidden in the desk drawer in the library. Not addressed, just written, detailed, about things from the war, things that aren't in the history books." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her expression remained calm. "Did you keep them?" Letitia looked ashamed. "I burned them. I was afraid. They mentioned the brigadier by name. If those letters got out, everything would fall apart." Penelope looked devastated. "You never told me." "I was protecting you." Miss Marple sat back in her chair. The room was no longer warm. It felt cold, as though the fire had turned to ice. She stood, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you for the tea. You've both been most generous." As she walked down the path toward the gate, the clouds broke open above her and a soft drizzle began to fall. It was time for the colonel. She found him the next afternoon at the cricket field, watching the groundsmen prepare for the spring season. He wore his usual tweed coat and gloves, his posture rigid, hands behind his back. Miss Marple approached him slowly. "Colonel Masters," she said gently. He turned, nodding with formal courtesy. "Miss Marple, what brings you out on a wet day?" "I find fresh air helps clear the mind." "Indeed." She stood beside him in silence for a moment, then spoke. "You lost something at the wedding." He blinked. "I don't believe I did." She reached into her handbag and withdrew the gold cufflink, holding it up delicately. "Ah, so I did," he said, too casually. "Thank you." He reached for it, but she did not release it. "Why did you lie about it?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Do be careful, Miss Marple." "I always am," she replied. "But you see, I know that you were arguing with Julian before the ceremony. Others heard you." "He was a dangerous man," the colonel said at last. "He had no honor." Miss Marple nodded. "Because of what he knew? About your activities during the war?" Colonel Masters flinched slightly. "We did what we had to, but Julian twisted it. He threatened to expose old files. He had connections, and yes, I tried to stop him, but I didn't kill him." She believed him, not because of what he said, but how he said it. He was ashamed, but not panicked. "There are other ways to kill a man than poison," she said quietly. "Reputation, for instance. The colonel gave a sad smile. He'd have done far worse if he'd lived. Miss Marple turned away then, tucking the cufflink back into her bag. One more visit remained. That evening she called on the vicar again. Reverend Bloxham seemed older now, as though the days had carved deeper lines into his face. "I need to know what Julian told you," she said, sitting across from him. The vicar folded his hands. He had uncovered something terrible, not just about the colonel, about the estate. The Littonstone inheritance was altered before the wedding. If Penelope married, she'd gain control of assets. Assets that were supposed to be frozen due to wartime contracts involving her father. Julian threatened to make it public. And who stood to lose everything if he did? The vicar didn't answer. He didn't need to. Miss Marple sat back, the final pieces falling into place. Secrets, shame, and a quiet war waged not with guns, but with silence. And someone in the village had killed to keep it buried. She looked out the window toward the darkening lane. The masquerade was almost over. The days that followed were quieter on the surface, but underneath, the village of St Elwick's simmered. The kind of silence that arrives not with peace, but with the hush before a storm. The murder investigation had not yet yielded an arrest, but the police presence had thinned. Inspector Caldwell seemed to believe the E.I. trail had gone cold. He had shifted his attention to paperwork and statements, choosing procedure over instinct. Miss Marple, however, was certain the mystery was not only unresolved, it was evolving. She had learned, through careful listening, that when a lie begins to fray, it rarely does so alone. One untruth tugs at another, and secrets that had once seemed safely buried begin to surface, piece by reluctant piece. And then, something unexpected happened. It began on a Wednesday morning as Miss Marple was returning from the baker's with a fresh loaf of currant bread. A knock came at her door, not hurried, but firm. When she opened it, she found Agnes Taylor, the florist's daughter, standing on the step, her eyes red-rimmed and her posture stiff with tension. "I need to talk to you," Agnes said. Miss Marple ushered her inside without question. The girl sat down on the edge of the armchair, clutching her handbag tightly, her fingers knotted together. "I've remembered something," she said. "Something from the wedding day." Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea, then waited, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the truth to surface naturally. "I was behind the marquee," Agnes began, her voice low, "near the dessert table. Julian had just walked off after speaking with Penelope. He looked upset, not angry. More like shaken. He was holding a small envelope. I saw him tuck it into the pocket of his waistcoat." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And then? Someone else came around the corner. I thought it was just another guest at first, but it was Letitia." Miss Marple paused, lifting the teapot without pouring. "Letitia Price." Agnes nodded. "She didn't see me. I don't think she knew I was there, but I saw her approach Julian. She looked angry. He said something, I couldn't hear what. But then he handed her the envelope. She took it. Just like that." "And what did she do after?" "She turned and walked back toward the house. That was maybe 10 minutes before the scream." Miss Marple sat in stillness. Not shock. She rarely felt shock these days, but with a growing sense that what she had believed to be the underlying current of the mystery was shifting again. Letitia had burned letters. Yes. But had she also taken something that very afternoon? Something Julian had tried to deliver before his death? She thanked Agnes for her honesty and asked if she had told anyone else. "No," the girl whispered. "I was scared, but I keep thinking about it. That envelope. The way he gave it to her. It felt important. Like a final decision." When Agnes had gone, Miss Marple sat down at her desk and wrote a single line in her notebook. Letitia held the last letter, not burned, hidden. The next morning she paid a visit to the Littonstone estate. She found Letitia in the back garden, pruning roses with mechanical precision. Her face was worn, as though the weeks had aged her more than the years ever had. "Miss Marple," Letitia said, not unkindly, but without warmth. "I thought I might borrow a recipe," Miss Marple replied easily. "Your sponge cake at the wedding was exquisite." Letitia paused, shears in hand. "You're not here for a recipe." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "No, dear, I'm here for the letter." There was no confusion in Letitia's eyes, no attempt at denial. She stared at the rose bush for a moment longer, then placed the shears carefully on the bench beside her. "He gave it to me that afternoon," she said quietly. "Said it would clear everything up. That would explain why he had to do what he was about to do." "And what was he about to do?" Miss Marple asked. "Reveal everything during the toast," he said, but he looked tired, like he didn't want to do it but had to, like he was at the end of his tether. Miss Marple waited. "I read it," Letitia continued. "Of course I did. He'd written it like a confession, but not about himself. About the brigadier, the estate, about how he'd found out that the marriage wasn't about love, it was about control, about money. If Penelope married, the inheritance would fall into new hands, hands tied to off-the-book dealings from the war. "And where is the letter now?" Miss Marple asked. Letitia hesitated. "I hid it in the pantry, under the flour bin." "You didn't destroy it?" "I couldn't. I thought about it, but something stopped me. Maybe I was hoping someone like you would ask." Letitia led her inside and retrieved the envelope. It was still sealed. Miss Marple opened it carefully and read. The letter detailed not only financial manipulation, but also the deliberate orchestration of the marriage itself. Julian had suspected that Penelope had been pressured into the engagement to protect her father's name. The wedding had been fast-tracked, not out of love, but to keep certain wartime contracts from becoming public record. Contracts that would be invalidated if scrutiny was placed upon the family's financial holdings. There was a final line. "I loved her once. Maybe I still do. But I can't be part of this. Not quietly." Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it gently into her bag. It explained a lot, but not the murder. She thanked Letitia and left. As she walked down the gravel path, she passed the brigadier returning from the village. He tipped his hat, stiff as ever. "Good day, Miss Marple," he said. "Good day, brigadier," she replied. "A fine day for truth." He looked at her, puzzled, then moved on without another word. Back in the village, a curious thing happened. The local newspaper, which had so far only offered sparse reports about the tragedy, suddenly received an anonymous packet. It contained copies of documents that tied the Littenstone family to a series of wartime contracts involving undisclosed profits and foreign assets. It wasn't the letter Julian had written, but it was enough to start a fire. By evening, the villagers were speaking again, but now with a strange mixture of excitement and fear. The scandal was no longer confined to whispers, and yet, even as the truth began to surface, Miss Marple felt an unease settle in her bones. This wasn't over. If anything, the revelation had served as a distraction, a smokescreen. Something had happened in those final minutes before Julian's death. Something that still had not been spoken aloud. A new thread had emerged, but it was tangled. Someone had used Julian's intention to reveal the truth as a cover for something darker. His murder had not simply been an act of silencing a voice. It had been personal. It had been timed, and it had been staged to look like justice, when it was anything but. Miss Marple sat that night with her notebook open. She made a new heading, "Truth Released, Killer Still Hidden." And beneath it, she wrote just 2 words. Penelope watches. The truth had begun to spread through St. Elwick's like spring fog creeping over the hills, gradual, inevitable, and chilling. With the contents of the anonymous packet now public, the Littenstone name, once uttered with reverence, had become the subject of late-night mutterings and morning headshakes. Brigadier Lytton Stone had ceased appearing in public altogether. Penelope was rarely seen. Arthur, her husband of only days, had taken to long, solitary walks, his head bowed, as if each step carried the weight of a future he could no longer decipher. But for Miss Marple, the mystery had shifted again. The scandal was not the climax. It was the stage. Julian Hargrove's death was never truly about wartime contracts or veiled financial fraud. Those were fuel for the fire, yes, but the match had been struck by something smaller, colder, more personal. It was time to find the hand that lit it. Miss Marple spent the following morning reviewing every observation, every note, and every interaction. One fact rang louder than the rest. Julian had changed course. He had been poised to reveal everything at the wedding toast, and yet, moments before the incident, he had handed his final letter to Letitia and turned away. Why? Because someone had reached him first, someone who had said something, done something that altered the course of the afternoon. And that change had cost him his life. She needed a test, a way to poke gently at the truth, to press on the surface of each suspect until one of them cracked, just slightly. She began with Penelope. The opportunity presented itself during a visit framed as pure courtesy. Miss Marple arrived with a jar of rhubarb and ginger preserve and a suggestion for a quiet walk around the garden. Fresh air, she said, would do the bride good. Penelope hesitated before agreeing, slipping on a shawl and gloves. They strolled down the rose path, where petals clung stubbornly despite the rain. "You know," Miss Marple said as they passed the arbor, "there's something comforting about roses. Even when the season's wrong, they insist on blooming." Penelope gave a distracted smile. "They're honest flowers," Miss Marple added. "They don't pretend to be something they're not. When they're cut, they bleed." The younger woman's step faltered, just slightly. She covered it with a cough. "Miss Marple," she said after a pause, "do you really believe it was someone close?" "I do," Miss Marple replied calmly. "And I think Julian did too. He was afraid, not of exposure, but of betrayal." Penelope stopped walking. Her arms were folded now, her expression tight. "He could be cruel," she said quietly. "Charming, yes, but manipulative. He didn't care who got hurt." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And yet, he loved you." Penelope didn't reply. Miss Marple let the silence sit between them like fog between hedgerows. "I've always believed," she said softly, "that there are two kinds of secrets. The ones we hide to protect others, and the ones we hide to protect ourselves." Penelope turned to her. Her eyes were shining, not with tears, but something harder. Julian wasn't the only one with secrets. It wasn't a confession, not quite. But it was the closest Miss Marple had come. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple invited Reverend Bloxham and Arthur Pomfret to tea. She chose her words carefully, watching for reactions. The vicar was tense but steady, repeating the same version of his encounter with Julian. Arthur, however, was scattered, his thoughts darting like birds startled from hedgerows. "I don't even know what's true anymore," he muttered as he stirred his tea. "Penelope won't talk to me. Father says to keep my head down. But how can I? I married into something I didn't understand." Miss Marple offered him a scone, and with it a quiet suggestion. "Do you remember," she said, "how Julian looked just before the photographs?" Arthur frowned. "Not exactly." He had just spoken to Penelope. Arthur's spoon stopped. "Yes," she pulled him aside. It looked like they were arguing. Miss Marple's hands folded gently in her lap. "She says she barely spoke to him," she said. Arthur looked up, something dawning behind his eyes. Wait, that's not true." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "It isn't." That evening she returned to the rose garden one final time. Penelope was not there, nor Letitia, nor the brigadier. The light was dimming. shadows falling long over the gravel paths. She moved slowly, pausing at the place where Julian had fallen. She remembered the champagne, the peonies, the scream. She also remembered Penelope's reaction, delayed, as though rehearsed. She closed her eyes, listening not to the sounds of the present, but to the echoes of that terrible moment. Then she opened them and walked up to the Lytton stone house. Letitia answered the door again, startled to see her at this hour. "I think," Miss Marple said, "it's time I spoke with Penelope. Alone." Letitia hesitated, then stepped aside. Penelope was in the sitting room, the fire casting long flickers across her face. Miss Marple sat across from her. "I know what happened," she said. Penelope didn't speak. "You called Julian aside," Miss Marple continued. "You told him to stop, to back away from the toast. Perhaps you begged, perhaps you threatened. I imagine he was conflicted. But ultimately, he agreed. He gave the letter to Letitia, and he returned to the crowd." Penelope's hands were clenched in her lap. But someone else was watching, someone who knew what Julian was about to do and feared the damage it would cause, personally, not just for the family, for themselves. For their future, Miss Marple paused. "Penelope, I don't think you killed him, but I do think you know who did." Penelope's face remained still, but her lips trembled. "I didn't want him to die," she whispered. "I just wanted him to stop." "I know," Miss Marple said softly. There was a long silence. Then Penelope spoke again. "I told Arthur, after Julian gave me that final look. I panicked. I told Arthur what Julian had found. About inheritance, about the contracts. I didn't think he would. I didn't know he would do anything." Miss Marple's heart sank. It was not what she had expected, but it fit. Arthur Pomfret. Quiet, passive, overwhelmed. And yet, if he believed his bride had been manipulated, if he believed Julian was using her, threatening her, a crime born not of money but of love. Miss Marple left the house without another word. She walked back through the village as the street lamps blinked on, one by one. She did not call the police. Not yet. There was one more thing she needed to see. One more conversation. One more test. The wind carried a strange stillness over St. Elwick's the next morning, a stillness that was not peace, but expectancy, the kind of hush before a truth is spoken aloud and cannot be taken back. The clouds had pulled apart just enough to let sunlight pour through in pale shafts, but the warmth did little to soften the tension building in the air. Miss Marple had spent the night in reflection. The pieces had finally settled into place, not all at once, but in increments, like a clock slowly clicking into the correct hour. The murder of Julian Hargrove had not been a crime of passion nor a random act of malice. It had been calculated, reactionary, triggered not by opportunity alone, but by a desperate sense of justice tangled in personal delusion. Now the time has come to bring the truth to light. She chose a quiet setting, the church hall, neutral ground for all involved. With gentle insistence, she requested the presence of Inspector Caldwell, Penelope, Arthur Pomfret, Reverend Bloxham, Letitia Price, and Colonel Masters. She did not issue accusations, only invitations, and something in her tone made it impossible to refuse. They gathered in the modest room where teacups and hymn books usually shared space. The curtains were half-drawn, letting in slivers of morning light that striped the wooden floor. Miss Marple stood at the head of the table, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, as if preparing to deliver a sermon more than a revelation. "Thank you all for coming," she said softly. "I realize these past days have been heavy with sorrow, confusion and fear, but I believe we owe it to Julian Hargrove, and to ourselves, to face what truly happened." Inspector Caldwell leaned back in his chair, arms folded, skeptical, but quiet. Penelope sat rigid, her hands cold in her lap. Arthur looked as though he hadn't slept at all. Miss Marple began, not with accusation, but with a question. Why did Julian change his mind about the toast? No one answered. He intended to expose the inheritance scheme, she continued. He planned to reveal the alterations to the estate, the wartime contracts, and the financial manipulation behind the wedding itself. He had even written a letter, which he gave to Letitia. Letitia, sitting near the window, gave a small nod. But something, or someone, stopped him. Miss Marple turned her eyes to Penelope. You spoke to him, didn't you? Just before the photographs. Penelope lowered her gaze. Yes. I asked him not to do it. I begged him. Because you were protecting your father? Penelope's voice cracked. Because I was afraid. Afraid of what would happen to all of us. Miss Marple nodded. And you told Arthur? A long pause. Arthur looked up slowly. I didn't plan anything, he said quietly. I didn't know what to do. She was devastated, and Julian, he'd made himself into a villain. It felt like he was toying with her, playing a game. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. So you confronted him? Arthur swallowed hard. Yes. Just after she told me, I found him by the fountain. I asked him what he was doing. I told him to leave her alone. What did he say? Arthur's hands tightened into fists. He laughed, said it was too late, that the truth was already out, and that if Penelope didn't stand beside him, then she'd fall with the rest. And that, Miss Marple said, was when you decided to act. Arthur looked at her, his face pale. I didn't poison him. I didn't have anything, but he had a glass in his hand. A drink. He turned his back to me, and I pushed him. The room went still. I didn't mean to kill him, Arthur whispered. I just wanted him to stop. He fell, hit the edge of the fountain. I didn't even realize at first. I thought he was drunk. I walked away. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. The silence wrapped itself around the room. Inspector Caldwell leaned forward now, expression unreadable. We found no trace of poison, he said. It could have been the fall, a blow to the skull. Miss Marple nodded. That's what I concluded as well. The angle of the body, the blood pattern, all consistent with a fall, but not a fall caused by an accident. Penelope had buried her face in her hands. Reverend Bloxham sat stunned, his lips moving in silent prayer. Colonel Masters looked toward the window, his jaw clenched. Miss Marple stepped closer to Arthur. You didn't plan to kill him, but the fear you acted on, that was real. You believed he was going to destroy Penelope, and so you stopped him. Arthur closed his eyes. I ruined everything. No, Miss Marple said gently. You tried to protect someone you loved, but you did it the wrong way. Inspector Caldwell stood then, approaching Arthur with slow, heavy steps. We'll need a full statement, he said. Arthur nodded. I'll give it. Miss Marple turned to the others. There is more than one kind of justice. What Julian threatened to reveal was true, but the way he went about it, so publicly, so theatrically, risked tearing down more lives than necessary. Perhaps he had good intentions, or perhaps he only wished to prove his power one last time. She looked at Letitia. You did what you thought was right, destroying the first letters, hiding the last, but truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep we bury it. Letitia's eyes were wet with tears, but she gave no response. Then Miss Marple turned to Penelope. You loved Julian once. I believe that, and I believe you wanted to do the right thing. But love does not excuse silence, and fear cannot protect us forever. Penelope said nothing. There was no anger in her eyes, only grief. As Inspector Caldwell led Arthur from the hall, the others remained seated, stunned by the weight of what had unfolded. The masquerade had ended, but the masks had not simply been removed. They had crumbled. Outside, the village continued as it always did, carts rolling down the lane, shopkeepers tending to window displays, dogs barking in the distance. But inside the church hall, the truth had settled into every corner. Miss Marple remained a moment longer, staring out the window at the grey sky beyond. Another life ended, another life changed, and yet the world spun on, because it always did, and that, she knew, was the great mystery of them all. In the days following the confession, a quiet fog seemed to fall over St. Elwick's, not of weather, but of reckoning. The village moved forward as all villages must, but it did so cautiously, as if every word and step might disturb the fragile stillness left behind. Arthur Pomfret had not resisted arrest. He gave his statement in full, with little embellishment and no attempt to justify what he had done. He admitted to the confrontation, to the push, and to leaving Julian where he fell, believing, perhaps hoping, that he was merely unconscious. The post-mortem confirmed the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. No poison, no elaborate murder weapon. Just one sudden, tragic moment. There would be a trial, of course, but not one likely to grip the nation's headlines. The press, already bored by the lack of scandalous flair, had moved on to newer stories, leaving St. Elwick's to reckon with its own truths in private. Miss Marple, for her part, declined attention. She made no speeches, gave no interviews, and turned down a letter from a London crime magazine requesting her thoughts on the psychology of provincial homicide. Instead, she returned to her quiet routines, walking through the churchyard, pruning her small garden, and sitting by the fire with her knitting and a book of classical poetry. But if the world around her moved on, the people within it had changed. Penelope Lytton Stone remained in her father's house, the marriage annulled in private but accepted in silence. No one spoke of Arthur in her presence. She did not cry publicly. She did not beg for sympathy. Instead, she withdrew like a flower in winter, pale, stiff, holding her petals tightly shut. Miss Marple visited her only once after the revelation. They sat in the drawing-room in companionable quiet. "I suppose this will follow me forever," Penelope had said. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "The past always follows us, my dear, but it does not have to lead us." "I didn't kill him," Penelope whispered, "but I watched him die." "No," Miss Marple said. "You watched someone you loved fall. That's different and far more painful." Letitia Price, once the silent guardian of the Lytton Stone estate, quietly resigned her post and left the village to stay with her sister in Yorkshire. She did not say goodbye to many people, nor did she explain her reasons. But Miss Marple understood. Letitia had held too many secrets for too long. Some lives can't be rebuilt in the same place where they were unraveled. Reverend Bloxham continued his sermons, though something in his voice had changed. His words were softer now, more weighted. He often spoke of grace, not in the grand, sweeping theological sense, but in the small daily ways we forgive one another. Attendance at his services grew in the weeks that followed, not out of obligation, but out of quiet need. Colonel Masters left without ceremony. A short note pinned to the door of the hotel simply read, "Called back to London." Indefinitely. Miss Marple doubted he would return. Some truths, once revealed, made staying impossible. And the villagers? They did what villagers always do. They adapted. The gossip turned slowly into memory. The shock became a story told in lowered voices at twilight, or to newcomers by those who'd lived through it. Life resumed, but with new shadows in its corners. Miss Marple, sitting one afternoon in her rose garden, was joined by young George Merriweather. He sat beside her without invitation, chewing an apple and watching the bees drift lazily between the blossoms. "Is it true," he asked after a while, "that Mr. Pomfret didn't mean to do it?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "He meant to stop something, but he didn't realize how easy it is to go too far." George looked thoughtful. "I heard Mum say it was because he loved her." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Love can be both a shield and a weapon, George. It all depends on how you use it." They sat in silence for a while. "Will things ever go back to normal?" he asked. "No," she replied. "But they'll go on, and sometimes that's enough." As summer crept in, the village returned to its rhythm. The hedges were trimmed. The baker's window is filled with fresh rhubarb tarts. Children played near the green again, their laughter echoing in the same places where whispers once gathered. And Miss Marple, wise, quiet, watchful Miss Marple, did what she had always done. She listened, she noticed, and she remembered. Because that was the way of her kind. Not the dramatic detectives of city novels, but the silent keepers of truth. The women who understood that evil rarely roared, it whispered, that people wore masks not out of malice, but out of fear, and that the greatest mysteries were never just about who did it, but why. Julian Hargrove had died because he uncovered a lie, but it was not the lie that killed him, it was the reaction to it, the panic, the pride, the protection of love, and that, in the end, was what Miss Marple carried with her, not just the facts, but the sadness behind them. As she closed her notebook on the final page of the case, she did not write a triumphant flourish or underline her conclusions. She simply made a note in her careful, spidery handwriting. Justice is never simple, but sometimes it is just enough. And with that, she rose from her chair, tied on her gardening apron, and stepped into the sunlit path of roses, where the petals, despite everything, continued to bloom.